You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Hello and welcome to TFM's local books and comic show here for Star Trek, and I'm just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and so excited to have back with me, as he is every single episode, is Mr. Casey Pettitt. How are you, Casey?
Hello, I am good. I feel like we've been meeting a lot more lately because we've just been diving into so many books, and it's exciting.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I mean, we got the opportunity to talk about the making of book for Star Trek First Contact, which was really fun. And we actually kind of slid that into our schedule, so you're getting a couple more episodes here at the end of the year, which is fun because we're actually covering a book called Ship of the Line by Diane Carey, which was the prequel to First Contact, which, you know, I'm very excited to be able to finally get to here on this show.
Yeah, and I've never read it before, so I'm looking forward to talking about it. Oh man,
I can't wait to hear what you think. Before we get into that, we've got some news that we've got to cover. We've got a new comic that's come out, so we're going to be talking about Star Trek Resurgence Part 1. But we want to thank everybody for joining us. We really do appreciate it, and we'd really like it if you would go over to whatever podcatcher you're listening to this show on, and you hit the subscribe button. That way you'll get the shows as soon as they drop. And then we'd also appreciate it, if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give us a star rating and a review. Those 5 stars make a huge difference in people finding the show. And we read all the reviews we get out on the podcast, so we can do that for you as well. You can also find us on social media. We're on Twitter and Instagram under Trek FM. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Trek FM. We've got our listeners-only discussion group, and we'd love to talk to you there. And you can talk to listeners from all over the world. You can also find us online at Trek.fm, and you can even go to Trek.fm/contact, and you can send us an email if you'd like. Casey, I was just reminded of this because I got an email on the other show, the 602 Club, and I was like, well, I would love to get some emails here for Literary Trek, so that would be fantastic. And last but not least, we'd really appreciate if you would support the network through Patreon. Patreon.com/TrekFM. We have some wonderful associate producers. One is sitting across the virtual table with me right now, Casey Pettitt, as well as Greg Rosier. We do appreciate their support. And in all honesty, most people don't know this, but it actually costs quite a bit of money to put a network of this size online. And so we're a little bit below where we'd like to be. So, in the gift of the holiday season, maybe you'd like to support us. So go to patreon.com/TrekFM and see how you can be part of the team. So, Casey, as we look at Star Trek Resurgence Part 1, were you aware that not only we were getting this comic, but that it's going to be the tie-in to a new upcoming Star Trek video game?
We've been getting so many comics lately that I'm having a hard time keeping up with what's coming out. I think I'd heard about this, and I've certainly heard about the video game, but, it's kind of cool how they're doing this with the comics. It gives us a lot of different comics to read, and every time they do a prequel to a new season of the show or to a video game in this case. So this one really wasn't on my radar. So when I saw it on the outline today, I thought, well, another comic to read, another week, another comic. It's not a great time for Star Trek novels since we've only had a few this year, but it's an awesome time to be a comic fan, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I actually enjoyed about this comic was the fact that it is set in the 24th century, and we're about 5 years after the Dominion War, and we're dealing with at least one character we know, which is Leah Brahms, and then we have this new starship that we've never had before, the Resolute, which is a great name for a Star Trek starship. And you know, I think the thing about this comic is that, you know, I don't want to get too deep into the story, because I thought that this comic had a really interesting story to it. And it you know, it involves lots of things that are classic to Star Trek, like new warp engine design possibilities, kidnapping, covert missions. I mean, this comic just kind of has it all. And, you know, I think, I don't know, there's just something about it that felt refreshing to me. And I can't quite put my finger on it, but what did you think, Casey?
No, I agree. You know, for especially not having really any background knowledge of this comic, you know, we don't have anything to base it on since it's a prequel to a video game that hasn't come out yet. I actually thought this did a really good job of introducing all of who I assume are going to be kind of the major characters in the video game. So really, even in just this first issue, we've got a few core characters that we focus on, but I already kind of know who this crew is to some extent and how they work together. And like you said, there's a lot of great Star Trek tropes going on in here that make it feel like these are characters, this is a ship that would show up on the show somewhere. That this is like an adventure they're starting that we would see on screen somewhere. So, you know, it was all over the place, but I'm really intrigued to see where this is going to go, because we've had some comic series in the not too distant past that have been kind of a slow burn. This one I feel like kind of takes off right away, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes. And honestly, I'm going to be a little sad, I think, when the comics are done, because then I'm going to have to go out and get a video game, and I'm not a gamer, so I don't know how I'm going to finish the story.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really interesting to me, and in that, the thing that really piques my curiosity here is the fact that this is a lead into a video game, and you know, I'm intrigued enough to want to go learn more about the video game. And part of that is because, you know, it's something we were talking about off air because of all the recent interviews that have been going on with the new showrunner and the final showrunner of Star Trek Picard for season 3, is the way in which they talked about basically Star Trek Legacy. And this, I think maybe that's what resonates with this comic with me, is that it feels as though it takes the legacy of Star Trek seriously from the beginning by setting it post-war Dominion War. Also, you know, giving us some things that we are familiar with. We've seen this starship before in Deep Space Nine, even though we've never seen the inside of it. This type of design. And, you know, the uniforms are familiar. We have one familiar character. And then, like you said, there's a bunch of different kind of Star Trek tropes. And so I feel like that's a good place to start. And, you know, and two, we can go pretty much anywhere with the story because, you know, there's only one character here that we know. So whether or not they live or die or what happens there is all up in the air. You know, even for Leah Brahms, who's that character we know, anything could happen, right? And so it just feels almost like it feels almost like an Aventine series, right? Where you know a couple of the characters and then the rest of the characters are new, but there's enough familiarity to ground you, and then the rest of it is just an enjoyable exercise in being in the universe that you love. And so, that's the thing that I came in this comic with absolutely no expectations, obviously, because it's like a tie into a video game. And I was just really pleasantly surprised. Yeah,
this is a series where, I wouldn't mind if they kept going past the video game. Yep. Like you said, it's 5 years after the end of the Dominion War, but it's, several years before Star Trek Picard, so there's a lot of time to play with, too. And again, like you said, there's just the one character so far that we have any familiarity with, so it is kind of, as Picard says, the sky's the limit. They can kind of do anything, and I don't know what else to say. They're off to a great start. I'm really looking forward to the next issue, and dang it, I might have to get the video game.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you have an Xbox Series X or S or the PS5 or 4, because that's apparently what it's going to be played on. I'm a little bit disappointed in that, because that means that I would not be able to play this game unless I finally bought the Xbox X, because I only have the Xbox One, and I've been thinking about doing that because I know the new Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is going to be coming out next year, but that is not the time to do it right now. But we'll see. If you were to rate this, Casey, what do you think?
Honestly, I'd probably have to give it a 5 out of 5, just because I'm, like I said, kind of blown away by my interest in this. I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes. There was nothing in this that I thought needed to be taken out. We're getting to know the characters. It was just a great introduction to the series. And the artwork was great. The writing was good. It wasn't, it was a quick read. I don't know. I just really enjoyed it. So I'm 5.
I think for this one, I'd probably go 4 out of 5, and it's not any knock against it or anything. And part of it is just like it's not. There's nothing perfect about it or whatever. But I think, like you said, the best part about this is that I am intrigued enough to really be excited to see what does happen. I believe this is a 5-issue arc, and so to me, that's exciting. And I think one of the things you mentioned is that this story starts off with a bang. Like we start and we go. This doesn't seem to be like, this first issue doesn't feel like filler in any way. It feels very important to the story because it's really setting up the main crux of the story and some of the the different relationships between crew members and the captain and Leah Brahms in the first place. So all of that I think is the pacing feels great, the story feels good. You said and I thought the artwork was good as well. So, yeah, absolutely. I definitely think if you're a Star Trek fan, and even if you're not, interested in the game at all, this is a fun story. And so I'm excited to see where it goes. So, yeah, definitely 4 out of 5 for me.
There's a good cliffhanger kind of reveal at the end, especially if you're kind of a deep-cut Next Generation fan. I'm not going to say any more than that. Pick up this issue, read it. It's definitely worth a read.
Well, Casey, I've just looked at my watch. I think we got to get out of here. We got to go to the new ship launch. I think it's a new Enterprise, maybe?
Let's go take a look.
So we are at Ship of the Line by Diane Carey, which was a hardcover release, which is always fun in Star Trek books back in the day. And it was the one that was meant to kind of fill in the gap between Star Trek Generations and First Contact. In fact, giving us and everybody the first flight of the Enterprise E, which is very exciting. But before we get into all that, honestly, Casey, one of the things that this book does is kind of fill in some gaps. And so one of the things that this book does, though, is it starts with Morgan Bateson's backstory. So we're getting a chance to, because he's going to be a big part of this story, as is his crew. And so we begin before they get caught in the temporal loop, which was an interesting thing to be able to do, and I think an important part of the story to do, because if we're going to spend a lot of time with them as characters, we do need some more introduction to them. So how did that feel for you kind of coming into this book? I mean, knowing that he's on the cover and everything, this is your first time to read it. Were you expecting to spend, a good quarter of the book with his crew before they hit the time loop?
I wasn't, and was so pleasantly surprised by that, because if we'd have just picked up, and it would have been so easy to just pick up, 3 years later, which is when the bulk of the book says 3 years after the events of Cause and Effect, which is like right after the destruction of the Enterprise D. It would have been easy to pick up right there, get a few people from his crew, whatever, but just focus on Morgan Bateson. But since his crew, his whole crew came with him, it wasn't just him on that ship that came through. It was really cool to see them in action. And, the USS Bozeman was, they call it a cutter, but it's like basically like a border defense ship, which could be just, a patrol ship. It might not be that exciting, but like we alluded to some of his kind of previous adventures, this rival Klingon that he had, kind of like Kirk had his rivals, like Bateson had his own too. And he was kind of a big man in this sector. And so to get this story that culminates in them going through the temporal anomaly that puts them into the Next Generation era was really cool to see, because then by the time we catch up, we know these people, were invested in them, and it gives us a little something to kind of build on, rather than just starting to get to know him from the moment they come through the time loop. So I'm really glad that she spent some time in that era, especially as it leads into the rest of the story. Because it was just a good way to start it. It was totally unexpected, because this book then ends up spanning so much time and eras. We get, kind of Star Trek, I don't know, was it Star Trek 2, 3? Was it set before Star Trek 2? I can't remember that opening.
Yeah, this would be before Star Trek 2.
Yeah. Oh, right, because they had just gotten the Monster Maroons. They kind of mentioned that. So yeah, we just get so many different eras. It was really, really fun, really good way to start the book, I thought.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think you're absolutely right that this is the place that you want to start if you're going to use this character as a big part of the story. And that crew, because we don't know a lot about them, and I think to give us an inside look into their psyche and what their life was like on that type of ship back in the day. Carrie kind of talks about the idea of them basically being like the U.S. Coast Guard. They're ships that are closer into home, but especially in this time period where you've got the Klingons and the Romulans, all as adversaries, and of course you would have lots of other races there on the frontier of space being more adversarial towards the Federation as it's growing at this time period, makes a lot of sense. And it really puts into perspective, this idea that we're kind of use later, and we're going to talk about when it comes to Picard kind of trying to rectify in his own mind his own journey and where he wants to go, and kind of bridging the gap, right, between these generations, and how things have changed, but also how things are the same. And so I think Bateson in starting with that in the past was really important. But there's another gap that we kind of are in, which I think does not work at all. And that is the way in which this book deals with what we know from Deep Space Nine and the Cardassian Klingon conflict, where this would be set with that happening. And none of what she writes here honestly lines up at all with what we know happened in Deep Space Nine. And I was really surprised by that.
I wondered if, whenever a new series, especially in this time period of Star Trek, started, and they started doing the novels, a lot of the early novels were really based on the series Bible before the author had even gotten to see anything on screen, see how the characters interacted or spoke or anything like that. I kind of wonder if there was a similar situation here where when she started writing the book or coming up with the plot, if that was kind of in the early season 4 of Deep Space Nine, where they maybe, as she was writing it, they were still fleshing out things in the writer's room of Deep Space Nine, and she just kind of had maybe a general plot to go from and thought they were going to go a different direction than they did. That doesn't totally make sense, though, just because, that it wouldn't have taken a lot to fix it, basically. They could have added a couple lines to fix some of it. So, yeah, it's a little mind-boggling.
And what's interesting, too, is that Season 4 of Deep Space Nine is in 95 to 96. This book comes out in 97. So there's not really an excuse for getting so much of this so wrong, unless it is written way earlier, which again doesn't make a lot of sense because the book coming out in 97, this would have come out right before First Contact comes out, and because she has actual lines from the book, at the very end, and maybe that's added in at the very end, but still, I think that's one of, I hated to get kind of to a big negative right at the beginning, but that is a huge negative to this book, is that as you're reading it, if you're any kind of fan of Deep Space Nine, you're sitting there scratching your head thinking, this just doesn't fit. Our 24th century storyline just doesn't really fit with where we are. And it's, I hate to say this, but I think it's absolutely true. It's kind of inexcusable that that's the case.
Especially with an author like Diane Carey, who was kind of the cream of the crop of authors back in this time period. And I think she typically wrote original series novels.
Yeah.
But she had written Next Generation before, and maybe she just wasn't too into Deep Space Nine. I'm not sure. One interesting thing is while we're on the subject of things just not working, I've personally felt like the Madred storyline didn't completely work, just because I don't know, it seemed kind of shoehorned in the whole plot with Picard and Madred. It just, I didn't need any of it, I guess. I didn't care what Madred was up to at this point. I didn't care what his relationship with his daughter was like. I think it did add a little bit for Picard's character and help him maybe get a little bit of closure, but even then, he's got other things that he was assimilated by the Borg, like that was probably way worse than what Madred did to him. So I felt like it was just an odd thing to do using him. I mean, they could have used any Cardassian to create these camps that these people were in. So having him felt a little bit more just because of name recognition or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, you're absolutely right. Like it's one of those things with the Madrid storyline for Picard. It obviously ties into the story we're telling with Picard, But the problem is that it doesn't fit with what we're talking about with like the 24th century story. Like it just feels so off that you're kind of left in a place where you're almost reeling because you're just this doesn't fit in. And I find that I think, in all honesty, that's a really frustrating place to be is that how much it doesn't fit in. And I think that's more of the problem to me than what they do with Madred. I mean, that what they do with him seems like obvious, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's easy ways to fix this and make it fit in with that storyline that we know from Deep Space Nine. They just didn't, and I think that's what makes that frustrating. So, it is what it is, and that's the unfortunate part of this is that whereas the Bateson storyline was a real key in filling in the gaps, the Madred storyline and the connecting with the Klingon-Cardassian conflict and its influence and the way it touched on the Federation really didn't fit in very much because, the other part of this is that the villain that we get, the Klingon villain with his connection with Bateson also doesn't fit because, again, it's not fitting in with the Klingon-Cardassian conflict in a way that makes sense in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, when you take the Cardassian stuff out of it, Bateson's rivalry with this Klingon and this Klingon who's been kind of stewing for 93 years to almost get his revenge. That was actually, I kind of liked that just because, what happens when you take somebody from essentially Kirk's era where they have to be a little bit more, the cowboy diplomacy or, they're out on the frontier and have to make decisions on their own. They make these personal enemies. You take Bateson out of the mix for 90 years, you've got this Klingon who is all but dishonored. I mean, I guess he really is dishonored, and his son is dishonored, and has to sit with that for 90 years. Then all of a sudden finds out that Bateson's back, his old enemy is back, and that I thought was and then Bateson going out to antagonize the Klingon essentially because he kind of just has this innate sense that the Klingon, that his rival, I can't remember his name, is like Kovara or something like that, but that he's out there waiting, and he's right. And this kind of duel, I guess, that they were having with each other was a really interesting storyline. This one that spans generations and gave Bateson something to kind of fight for. But it was also kind of just, once we got this whole backstory, and then once we're in the 24th century, that whole storyline was not glossed over, but just not as important as I thought it was going to be after reading, what I thought was a very good, kind of first quarter of the book with his backstory. So it's the one thing I think it did is helped us get to know Bateson a little bit more and how he's trying to fit in and how he still feels out of place in this century. And, kind of like Scotty did when he showed up in Relics, he felt like kind of a fish out of water. He, had to relearn everything. He had to recertify and, having, Bateson having something to kind of fight for was really an interesting storyline for him. And although, there's other stories. I just read Cold Equations, and he shows up in one of those books too. But, we don't get a lot of Bateson in other novels. So, getting some of him was fun. And, actually adding some to this character in that way was, I think, a good thing just for this character that was on screen for 20 seconds.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. To me, I think the biggest strength of the book is the storyline that we have for Picard and the way in which, they're there's a change that happens between Generations and First Contact. And a big part of that, and you can always attribute it to the conversations that Kirk and Picard have while they're together, which I think is 100% accurate. And yet this book takes that a little bit deeper as Picard comes to grips with the loss of the Enterprise D. He's also, and I think she rightly reminds us that he also lost the Stargazer. And this has a massive impact on him and his crew, and specifically Picard figuring out what he wants to do with his life. Does he want to take this opportunity to pursue, archaeology or being like a professor, or he has all these other interests, and the answer to this becomes him being able to interact with a holographic program that Kirk had put together, and that somebody had put together about Kirk with all of his logs, and basically creating the closest you could get to meeting Kirk by being able to relive his experiences and his thoughts about the different missions, and a really interactive experience. And so to me, that was fascinating to see that she continues the trend that you got in Generations, and then it amplifies it by helping Picard come to the realization of who he is, what he wants to be, what he wants to do, and with realizing that it is okay to not be perfect, because Picard, I think, has always dealt with that idea of perfectionism, and he realizes that, by spending more time with Kirk in this way, Kirk didn't have it all together. Kirk made mistakes. Kirk was, somebody who is not a legend. Kirk was just a man who struggled like all other men to figure out whether or not they were making the right decision. And in fact, she actually uses a line that she wrote in the New Earth series where he says, I'm not choosing between right and wrong. I'm choosing from bad to worst, basically. And and I thought that was great because, that is something that I think anyone who is in this type of leadership position, you're going to be stuck with those positions, and it can be very difficult to deal with. And so, yeah, to me, this was absolutely the best part of the book, was Picard and his journey towards, figuring out who he wants to be.
I completely agree with that. I kind of had a love-hate with those kind of holodeck scenes, just because they got to be so long and were just showing, episodes of the original series, basically. But at the same time, what I really liked about it was that Picard got to interact with Kirk in the middle of those. And why did you do that? What were you thinking? And that's kind of how he learned that Kirk didn't have it all. He was sometimes just guessing, or he just had to make a decision fast, or, like you said, he had to decide between bad and worse, or two bad choices, or whatever. And I thought Picard's journey in this was so well done because of who we know Picard to be, both before and after, and even in the Star Trek Picard series. He's so closed off and compartmentalizes his feelings that he, at this point, has not really processed the fact that he's lost the Enterprise D. Or the fact, he has this, realization, like you said, that he's now lost both ships that he's ever commanded. But he's trying to decide if he just should move on, when in reality, anybody would probably fall into depression or anything. And I think he is in his own way, which is why he's considering if he should essentially retire or do something else, become a Starfleet Academy Commandant or something like that. And he has to learn from Kirk and just from everything that he's doing, that it's okay to feel bad about losing a ship, and he's almost, when he boards the Enterprise E for the first time, he's simultaneously kind of jealous of Bateson, like Picard wants to take command, but also part of him is like, it's just another ship, it just happens to be called Enterprise. And by the end of it, you can tell he really the Enterprise is there's a legacy there with the Enterprise. As he said, it's the flagship of the fleet. As the Enterprise is barreling towards Cardassian space, cutting up planets and everything, he sees that means something, that the fact that it's the Enterprise, even though it's a different one, and can kind of realize that the ship really is kind of part of his crew and something that he can care about. And yeah, I thought his journey was really well done throughout this book, and like you said, it gave him just more time with Kirk that he didn't have in Star Trek Generations.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And another thing I was thinking of as you were talking is, this book is called Ship the Line, and there are a lot of quotes in here from the Horatio Hornblower series, which we know actually is what inspired Gene Roddenberry for Picard in the first place. So I thought that was very apropos. But the whole point of that is to remind Picard that, and he's reminded by Kirk, is that, the ship is a part of your crew. And I think, what really made that ring true was, when you think of First Contact, I just rewatched it after, we talked about the book, the making of book. And, when he tells Lily, if you're speaking of home, I like to think of this ship as home, and even though the Enterprise E is new to him, the ships are home, right? And in that way, I think Picard actually in this book, because at the beginning he talks about how, the crew might not be together and everything, and they've got to get used to that, and they've been lucky to have, each other for this amount of time, but that's not normal. And, I think what it comes down to for him is that he does realize that this is special. And part of that, I think, is being able to see those logs through Kirk's eyes when he sees, and he can see what McCoy and Spock and Scotty and Sulu and Uhura all mean to Kirk, right? And who they are to him. And he kind of I think he comes to the realization, it is okay for these people to be my family, and I think that's something that, and then that family is housed in a ship, which is your home. And, in that way, it becomes about protecting your home. Your home is just as much a part of you as, the people that live in it in many ways, right? And even more so when you're on a vessel that literally is keeping you alive in the middle of desolate space. So, I think all of these things just really make sense. And I really appreciate it about the book and Picard's journey. And again, I think it is the part that works the best in the story, because Bateson's story and journey, I think it feels a little bit more, I guess, truncated. I feel like, his story is about learning that he doesn't quite know everything there is to know about, Klingons, just because he fought Klingons 90 years ago. And I felt like, I don't know, I wish that there had, if you're going to tell the story, I almost feel like the whole story needed to be about him and his crew and this realization, other than trying to cram it into the story about, the Enterprise E and all of that, because it's just, whereas Picard's journey is really well done, I think, and obviously the main point of the story, I think if you're going to use this character of Bateson, I feel like he does deserve, even though we only saw him for like 20, 30 seconds in the episode, because of who he's played by, Kelsey Grammer, you feel like he deserves more. And that's just what I'm left with. He deserved more.
Yeah. And I like that throughout the book he was so sure of himself. With the Klingons that, like, I may be old school, but I still know what I'm doing. And ultimately, towards the end, he and Riker kind of come to an understanding with each other that, where Bateson is basically telling Riker, hey, you were right all along. I shouldn't have done what I did, and I should have taken a different approach. And Riker's telling him, yeah, but you were right, because the Klingons were planning to attack, and you did have a good instinct about that. And so, Bateson's journey was really kind of like this, finding his place in this new century and understanding that, yeah, he might still have good instincts, but he also still needs to learn how certain things operate, I guess, in the current time period. And one of the interesting things I actually thought was, especially as you were talking, with Picard about, he got so like, oh, we're a crew, we've been lucky to stay together, like we need to just appreciate, what we've got. And he kind of had the same attitude that he had in the Chain of Command episodes that Madred was actually in. When Jellicoe took over the Enterprise, he basically got pretty, I don't want to say cold-hearted with the crew, but just a very matter-of-fact, like, this is Starfleet. We go where we're sent. I'm being replaced as captain. You will serve him like you served me. And then Riker had this really contentious attitude with Jellicoe during those episodes, similar to how Riker acts with Bateson in this book, where, Riker kind of has a chip on his shoulder being back on the Enterprise, but not under the command of Picard. He really feels like Picard should have it, not Bateson. And he's being a pain in the command seat, which, one of the best parts of the book, I think, was when Riker and Bateson went at it. Like, they just went, like, they had this debate back and forth for pages on the right thing to do. And ultimately Riker saying, like, you're the captain. I'm not going to, like, walk off the bridge. I'm not leaving the ship. I'm going to follow your orders. But basically made his point really clear that he totally didn't agree with Bateson and their approach to go kind of take on the Klingons for a shakedown cruise. But there's almost a journey for Riker in that too, in that he's just he's not even jealous for himself. Like, he wanted command of the Enterprise E. He wanted command for Picard of the Enterprise E, and was just upset with Bateson for getting in his way. And I think over the course of the book, Riker kind of comes to realize that, hey, maybe sometimes the old ways can be a good way. Bateson had the right idea, just got there with the wrong logic, basically. I think is kind of how it's said, is, and I don't know. I kind of enjoyed Riker in this just because of how aggressive he was getting on his views, because he was, I don't know, I found myself agreeing with Riker a lot. Like, Bateson was being a little too cavalier with this shakedown cruise.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about that is that, Riker, all of his points are valid, right? And the arguments that he's making with Bateson, his arguments are completely valid. This ship isn't ready. There are tons of bugs. Everything is more complicated. This ship is meant to be run by over 1,000 people. They've got 300. All of these things that, Bateson is not used to when you're on a much smaller ship, and the technology wasn't quite as complicated then. And so, I do like Riker in this book, but I also, like you, I think there's an interesting journey for Riker, I think, learning from the old and being willing to learn from the old. The great thing about the book is the way in which he does show humility to say when he was wrong and when he was able to learn. So I think there's something really to that instead of just that bravado and machismo. Riker, which I think a character like Riker kind of gets dinged for, but here, I think written in a way in which he truly is somebody who, when it comes down to it, he's willing to learn from anyone as long as they do have something to teach. And I think there's a humility that he kind of gains in the book. He's willing to admit that. And I think that makes for a good character. So one of the things in the story is that Bateson talks about the idea that Starfleet has the advantage because it has diversity. But then it also does this by pointing out that Star Trek has also dealt with alien cultures as monoliths and is continuing to do so in this book. And it kind of really hurt the whole idea to me because you just pointing out that, we've only got Klingon warriors. Like, not all Klingons are just warriors. It was oxymoronic.
Yeah. I did find that a little interesting that, she literally has Bateson talking about these cultures as monoliths and how Starfleet, he doesn't even say Starfleet says they're monoliths. He just basically comes out and says that they're monoliths, or that they're, these monocultures that don't, they don't have anything except warriors, and all Cardassians are torturers, and all, but then that's how the book treats it too. So I thought it was, it was a little ironic that, I think she was trying to make a point, but kind of failed by basically showing exactly what he was talking about and saying that, oh no, they really are these monolithic cultures. So it was, in the book, we saw very little diversity in our crews, as far as I know, it was mostly humans on his crew. It was all,
right.
They didn't really show any of the diversity. He says they've got diversity, but I didn't see it anywhere. So it was kind of a funny bit to put in there without really doing anything with it.
Yeah. Something that you had mentioned that I thought was really as I thought more about it, I was like, this book does just kind of end really quickly. Like, the Madred storyline comes to a close really quickly. The Bateson storyline with Picard and the rest of the crew all comes to an end very quickly, basically because it feels like it turns into Home Alone at the end. Then everything's done, and it just kind of and now Picard is, Bateson's giving up the Enterprise to Picard, and we're out of page space.
Yeah, it was weird. In the last several chapters of the book, all of a sudden, all these plots were just kind of coming to a close, and it was just. No, actually, they weren't coming to a close. They had just closed in between chapters or something, and they, even Bateson's crew that were stranded on the Klingons ship. They just kind of show up. They're like, oh yeah, we got ourselves out and figured out how to work the ship, and now we're here to help save the day. Like, oh, okay, that would have been a neat story to see. Or, a lot of it was just even when Picard comes to rescue the prisoners on the Madred planet, or Madred village, or whatever they called it, he shows up, and then everyone just kind of comes out and is basically like, oh, cool, we're saved. And then he's like, you need to fight with us. And they say, okay. And then next chapter, the fight's over, and we've won. And welcome to Star Trek First Contact. It for the journey that we'd been on, good or bad, it was just kind of a sad way to end this book, where there could have been so much more to it, and there was just too much tell and no show. They may have just had kind of cut it off at chapter 20 or whatever, and just said, later that day, or something. That's kind of how it felt in those moments. So, I'm glad things turned out the way they did. I just would have liked to have seen some of it. And for being a hardcover book, they had space.
No, 100% agree. So, the other thing about this book, and I think obviously this is something that I think have complained about her books before, but you mentioned the fact that this book has a lot of jargon in it, especially when it comes to military and naval jargon. But I will also say, on top of that, I think there's no character here except for characters we see within those holodecks that sounds like themselves. Especially our TNG cast, none of them sound like the characters. So, to me, that just got really, really frustrating.
Yeah, the fact that the insistence on calling anybody lower than Captain Mr. We've never referred to Riker as Mr. Riker, but that's how he was referred to throughout the book. Or, we sometimes get Mr. LaForge or Mr. Scott or things like that, but never Mr. Riker. Like, that just doesn't even sound right saying it. Some of it, especially with Bateson's crew, I could forgive a little bit more, because his character was kind of put out there. Like, he said he loved the origin of words, and like he would explain, the origins of words, which I felt like it was more like her explaining to the reader what it was, but still, like, putting it in as Bateson's character was fine. And even having his ship and his crew kind of following more naval traditions was fine, but then putting that on our Next Generation crew and and Kirk's crew and everybody, it just didn't totally. It really took me out of it. Because, like you said, they just didn't sound like themselves, and so there's a time and a place. I enjoyed learning about that stuff, and that's clearly what she enjoys writing. But like I said, there's a time and a place, and a lot of this book was not the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did just think it was one of those places where, the jargon was what it was, and I'm used to that in her books in many ways. But I just think, obviously for tie-in fiction, you have to have the characters sound like the characters. I have to be able to hear their voice when I'm reading their dialogue, and I could never hear any of the TNG voices because none of them sounded right. And to me, that's always a big frustration in a book, and in all honesty, makes it a little bit of a failure to me. So I'm really interested because we had some really good things to say about the book. We also had some criticisms there of the book, so I can't wait to see where you end up landing with your ratings for Ship of the Line.
Yeah, I ended up giving this one a 2 out of 5. It's probably inching towards 2.5, but not enough to bump it up to a 3 on Goodreads. There was a lot of really good ideas in this. I almost would have preferred just a Lost Era book with Bateson and his crew. Maybe ending, that book at the anomaly, and then having him show up in this book somehow. I don't know. It's just like this book was just very disjointed. We've already talked about a lot of the stuff that we didn't like about it, and those things just detracted a lot for me. It's obviously very well written. Diane Carey's a really great writer, but for this particular story and these characters, it just was not really working for me. So landed at 2 out of 5. Where were you at?
Yeah, I'm actually in the same place. I think this book, like you said perfectly, this book had some interesting ideas, some good ideas, especially ones where, and we talked about the best ideas was really dealing with the identity of Picard and kind of cementing the change that starts with Generations. And I thought that was fantastic. But yeah, I think the book is of too many minds and is trying to do too many things. And it just needed more focus. And that's where I think the book could have really come together. And it just, it doesn't quite come together as you would like it to. So it's unfortunate because you want a book like this to succeed, especially since it involves, the premiere of one of my favorite Starship Enterprises, which is the E, which, I think the E is, to me, along with the Refit Enterprise, is just a beautiful ship. I've always been a huge fan. I love it inside and out. I think it was beautifully designed in every way, and in many ways, we don't spend enough time with the E, which is weird. So, all in all, it's just kind of a miss.
Well, even though we didn't maybe give that full, praise on that book, it was still really fun reading kind of the first adventure of the Enterprise E right after reading the making of Star Trek First Contact and watching that movie. And I don't know if you did this on purpose, but, with our next book being Enterprise, the first adventure, we're moving right into another, first adventure of an Enterprise. So whether you did it, by planning or not, I'm excited. I'm really excited to get into that one because it's another one that I have not read yet.
Yeah, well, I can't give away all of my secrets, Casey, but no, I'm right there with you. I'm actually excited to dive into that because I've never read it. And so to me, it's always fun and we're actually going to, as we end this year and get into next year, we're going to be reading a bunch of books that I've never read. And so to me, that's fascinating. We're going to be diving into that. We've also got the new David Mack book that's coming out. We'll be talking to him as well. We've got Voyager and Deep Space Nine coming up. We're going to be digging into some of the other franchises that don't get quite as much love just because there aren't as many books for them. So we're going to be doing that. So much coming up for you here. Hopefully everybody's continued to enjoy it. But Casey, people, want to catch up with you here in the holiday season because they're like, what does Casey want for Christmas? Where can people find you?
Well, you can find me all over social media at Knitting Trekkie. I've recently discovered Mastodon, which is where a lot of people are going in the great Twitter exodus. But for now, I'm also on Twitter and Instagram too. And find me lurking around in the Babel Conference on Facebook. I really like interacting with people there. And then you can also find me doing another podcast called Mickey's Marvels, which is where we discuss everything under the Disney umbrella, including Star Wars, Marvel, National Geographic, what have you. So that's a lot of fun.
Well, you could find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero. There's some other, social media platforms I'm on as well. It feels like there's a new one every day. But Twitter is probably mostly where I hang out. And you can also find me here on the network. We've got a show called The 602 Club, and so we talk a lot of Star Trek on the network, so we got this great place to go hang out where we get to talk about all of the other fandoms we love. We got some great shows to wrap up the year there as we're going to be hitting Andor and Enola Holmes 2. We've got Avatar Way of Water. I mean, we got a whiz-bang end to the year. You can also find me here doing The Orb with Chris Jones, talking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Warp 5 about Star Trek Enterprise, Saddle Up about Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and we talked a little bit about the fact that Picard is going to be coming up again. And with that, Casey, that means season 3. We'll be diving back in with the Artificial Tango, so make sure you check that out. And I'm over on the Nerd Party Network with a couple of shows. One is completed. I did with Drea Kaufman. It's called Owl Post, and we did every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And then last but not least, I'd love it if you checked out Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills. It's a Star Wars podcast, and we just geek out every week talking about Star Wars. But thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.